Glen wiped down his barber chair and straightened the small row of combs on the counter. The morning was cold and gray and the town outside was still quiet. A thin line of fog sat low on the street, and the barbershop windows had fogged up around the edges. Glen lit the small lamp on the counter, put his apron on, and unlocked the front door. He was not expecting anyone for another hour at least. He went to the back room and put a pot of water on the small stove to heat. He had done this every morning for 30 years. Same chair. Same combs. Same lamp. Same pot. Glen was a man of simple habits and he liked it that way. The town of Redwall was a quiet place, and his shop sat right in the middle of it, between the grain store and the old post office. Most days 2 or 3 men came in for a trim. Sometimes a boy came in with his father. It was never exciting and Glen had no desire for it to be. He came back to the front and stopped. The door was open. He was certain he had only just unlocked it, but he did not remember leaving it open. A cold breeze was pushing through the gap, lifting the edge of the cloth on the counter. Glen walked toward it slowly and then he saw it. In the corner beside the door, pressed flat against the wall as if trying to disappear into it, was a small creature. It was no bigger than a large dog, covered in pale green scales that caught the lamp light in a soft shimmer. It had 2 small folded wings pressed tight against its sides, for short legs, and a long thin tail curled around its own body like it was trying to hold itself together. Its eyes were enormous and amber-colored, and they were fixed on Glen with an expression that was not anger or threat but something much simpler. It was terrified. Glen stood still. He did not reach for anything. He did not call out. He simply looked at the small creature and let out a slow breath through his nose. It was a dragon hatchling. He had never seen one this close before. He had seen the great ones in the sky sometimes, far off, moving like slow clouds over the hills. Everyone in Redwall had. But this one was small and young and shaking so hard that its claws were making a faint clicking sound against the wooden floor. Glen took one slow step to the side, away from the door, giving the hatchling a clear path out if it wanted one. The hatchling did not move. It just kept its eyes on him, breathing in short quick bursts, its small sides rising and falling fast. Glen pulled a low wooden stool from beside the counter and set it down gently on the floor. He sat down on it, keeping himself small and low at eye level with the creature. He rested his hands on his knees and said nothing for a long moment. Outside, a cart rolled past on the street. The hatchling flinched at the sound and pressed harder into the corner. One of its small wings half opened and then folded back again, like it had thought about flying and then remembered it had nowhere to go. Glen watched it carefully. He had no idea how it had found his shop. He had no idea where it had come from or why it was alone. A hatchling this small should not have been wandering any street, let alone a human town. But here it was, and it was frightened, and Glen was not the kind of man who walked away from a frightened creature, no matter what kind it was. He tried speaking first. Low and even, the way he spoke to nervous boys who came in for their first haircut. "You are all right," he said. "Nobody is going to bother you." The hatchling blinked. Its shaking did not stop. He tried sliding a small piece of bread from his coat pocket, left over from breakfast, and setting it on the floor between them. The hatchling looked at it and then looked away. Not interested. Glen thought for a moment. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his harmonica. It was old, a little dented on one side, and he had carried it every day for more years than he could count. He played it most evenings on the back step when the shop was closed. It was the one habit his late wife had always asked him to keep, and so he had. He brought it to his lips and played. It was nothing fancy. Just a slow, simple tune he had learned as a boy, the kind with no particular name that wandered up and down without hurrying anywhere. The notes came out soft in the quiet shop, floating over the floor and into the cold morning air. The hatchling's head moved. It lifted slightly, tilting to one side the way a dog does when it hears something it cannot quite place. Its breathing slowed just a little. Glen kept playing, not looking directly at it, keeping his eyes soft and low. The tune turned and came back around to the beginning and he followed it again, easy and slow. The clicking of claws on the floor stopped. Glen played on. The pot in the back room began to whisper with heat, and the lamp on the counter burned small and steady, and outside the fog began to thin as the morning grew. And in the corner beside the door, the small green hatchling let its wings fold all the way flat, uncurled its tail from around its body and sat down on the floor. Its eyes were still watching Glen. But they were no longer afraid. 3 days after the hatchling first appeared, Glen arrived at his shop in the morning to find the back door nudged open. He stood in the doorway and looked down. The latch was not broken. The wood was not scratched. It had simply been pushed, carefully and quietly, just enough to fit a small body through. Glen looked at the gap, then looked into the back room and there was Pip, curled up on the floor beside the old iron stove, eyes half closed, tail wrapped loosely around its own feet. Glen said nothing. He stepped over the hatchling carefully, hung up his coat and put the water on to heat. Pip watched him with one eye. Glen went about his morning the same as always. He wiped the counter, straightened the combs, lit the lamp and unlocked the front door. When he came back through the rear, Pip had not moved. The hatchling was watching the stove with a calm, sleepy expression, its small sides rising and falling slowly in the warmth. Glen pulled his harmonica from his shirt pocket and played a few quiet notes. Nothing long. Just enough to say good morning. Pip's eyes closed the rest of the way. Glen smiled and went back to work. That was how it started. Every 2 or 3 days, Glen would arrive to find the back door nudged open and Pip already inside, settled near the stove or sometimes beside the barber chair at the front, where the morning light came through the window and lay warm and flat across the floor. The hatchling never caused trouble. It did not knock things over or scratch the furniture. It did not make noise or startle the customers. Most of the time it simply slept, curled into a tight shape with its wings folded and its tail tucked in, breathing slowly and looking like nothing in the world could bother it. Glen began playing different songs each visit. He did not plan it. It just happened naturally, the way things do when you settle into a quiet routine with someone. The first time he had played the slow wandering tune that had no name and that had worked. But the next visit he found himself playing an old folk song his father had taught him, a lively bouncing thing about a man walking a long road home. Pip lifted its head at that one, ears up, eyes bright. It did not look frightened. It looked curious. Glen played it through twice. Pip lay its head back down but kept its eyes open the whole time, watching Glen's hands move on the harmonica with an expression that was hard to describe. Focused maybe. Interested. Like it was learning something. After that, Glen started thinking about what to play before Pip arrived. He did not tell anyone this. It was just something he did in the evenings, sitting on the back step with the harmonica in his hands, working through old tunes he half remembered and finding the ones that felt right. Soft lullabies for the mornings when Pip seemed tired. Brighter, rounder songs for the days when the hatchling came in with its eyes wide and its head up, wanting something with a little more movement in it. Glen had no idea how he knew the difference. He just did. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Redwall was a small town, and small towns noticed everything. The first person to say something was Roy, who ran the grain store next door. He caught Glen one morning sweeping the front step and leaned over the low fence between their shops with his arms crossed. "That thing was in your back lane again last night," Roy said. "I know," Glen said. "You are not worried about it?" "No," Glen said. Roy looked at him for a long moment. "It is a dragon, Glen." "A small one," Glen said and went back to sweeping. Roy had nothing to say to that. Others were less calm about it. A woman named Vera, who lived 2 streets over and brought her husband in for a trim every other week, stopped at the shop window one morning and saw Pip curled beside the barber chair. She came inside with her mouth pressed into a thin line. "You cannot keep that in here," she said. "What happens when it grows?" "It is not mine to keep," Glen said, draping a cloth over a customer's shoulders. "It just visits." "Visits?" Vera repeated as if the word made no sense. "That is right." She left without another word, but Glen heard her talking to someone on the street outside, her voice low and sharp. He paid it no attention. Pip was asleep near the chair and had not moved once during the conversation. The customer in the chair, an older farmer named Earl who came in once a month, watched Pip in the mirror with quiet eyes. "Does it eat?" Earl asked. "Not here," Glen said. "Comes in, listens to a song or two, sleeps a while, then goes." Earl nodded slowly. "My dog does the same thing," he said. "Comes inside when it rains, sleeps by the fire, leaves when it is ready." "There you go," Glen said. Earl smiled at that and said nothing more. The weeks moved along. The weather turned colder and then slowly began to soften at the edges, the way it does when winter starts thinking about leaving. Pip kept coming. Glen kept playing. The back door kept being nudged open in the early mornings, and the floor beside the stove stayed warm, and the barbershop stayed quiet and steady. Glen never asked where Pip went between visits. He never tried to follow. He never put out food or made a bed or did anything to make the hatchling stay longer than it wanted to. He just played his songs and Pip just listened, and that was enough for both of them. It started with the traders. 2 men came through Redwall on a Wednesday morning with a cart full of wool and stopped at the inn on the far end of the street. By afternoon, half the town had heard what they brought with them. Not wool. Words. And the words were spreading faster than anything on wheels. A dragon queen was searching the lands. Her name was Sorra and she was not small. Not young. Not the kind of creature that nudged open back doors and curled up beside warm stoves. She was old and vast and known across 3 kingdoms, and she had not been seen this close to human towns in over 40 years. But she was close now. The traders had seen her themselves, or so they said, moving low over the hills to the east 2 nights before, her wings wide enough to block out a stretch of stars. She was looking for something. A hatchling. Her hatchling. Missing for weeks now, and Sorra had been covering ground in every direction, pulling apart forests and circling valleys and landing on hilltops to look out over the land below. The traders had heard it from a soldier on the road, who had heard it from a scout, who had seen the great dragon land and lift again 3 times in a single evening without stopping. By Thursday morning, Redwall was a different place. People stood in doorways and spoke in low voices. Mothers kept their children closer. Men who had never owned a weapon in their lives began checking the locks on their doors at night. The inn was full of quiet conversation that stopped when strangers walked in. Roy from the grain store came over to Glen's shop twice in one day, which he had never done before, and both times he stood at the counter and said the same thing in different ways. "You need to think about this, Glen." "I am thinking," Glen said both times and meant it both times, though not in the way Roy wanted. Vera came back too. She stood in the doorway of the barbershop with her arms folded and her eyes on Pip, who was sleeping under the front window in a square of pale morning light. Her voice was quieter than usual, which somehow made it worse. "If that dragon comes here and finds her hatchling in your shop," Vera said slowly, "what do you think she does to the town?" Glen set down his broom and looked at her. "I think she takes her child home," he said. Vera stared at him. "You do not know that." "No," Glen said. "I do not." "Then you understand why people are frightened." "I do," Glen said. "I just do not think frightened is the right thing to be." Vera left again. Glen picked up his broom again. Pip slept on. The rumors did not stop at Vera and Roy. A man named Alf who worked at the post office stopped Glen on the street and told him in a low urgent voice that the town elder, a stiff old man named Ward, was talking about sending word to the nearest garrison for soldiers. Just in case. Just to have them close. Glen listened to all of it and nodded and went back to his shop. He stood inside for a moment and looked at Pip. The hatchling was on its side now, one small wing half open against the floor, its tail moving slowly the way a sleeping dog's tail sometimes does, twitching at something in a dream. Its scales caught the window light and turned it into something soft and green and warm. It looked nothing like something to be afraid of. It looked like something that had found a safe place and was using it the way safe places are meant to be used. Glen went back to sweeping. He thought about it clearly and without rushing, the way he thought about most things. He turned it over the way you turn a stone to look at both sides. A great dragon was searching the land for this hatchling. That was true. The town was frightened. That was also true. And Pip came here freely, left freely, and had never once been held or kept or stopped. That was the part that seemed most important to Glen. He had not taken the hatchling. He had not hidden it. He had not even invited it. Pip had walked in on its own through an unlocked door and decided to stay for a while each day, the same way a stray cat decides a particular porch belongs to it. Glen had simply not turned it away. He did not believe a mother, even a dragon mother, would burn a town for that. He could be wrong. He knew that. But he had lived long enough to know that most of the terrible things people spent their time dreading never arrived, and the ones that did arrive were rarely as terrible as the waiting had been. On Friday evening, just before closing, Earl came in and sat in the barber chair without needing a trim. He just sat, watching Pip in the mirror. "Ward is going to call a meeting," Earl said. "About what to do." "I heard," Glen said. "Are you going?" "If they want me there, I will go," Glen said. Earl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What will you tell them?" Glen looked at Pip in the mirror. The hatchling had woken and was sitting up straight, watching Glen's shirt pocket the way it always did when it thought a song might be coming. Glen reached in and pulled out the harmonica. "I will tell them the truth," he said. "That the hatchling is safe. That it is not afraid here. And that a frightened town is a lot more dangerous than a sleeping dragon." He began to play. Pip closed its eyes. Outside, Redwall whispered on into the dark. It happened on a Tuesday. The morning had been ordinary in every way. Glen had opened the shop at his usual hour, put the water on, wiped the counter, and lit the lamp. Pip had arrived before sunrise, slipping in through the back the way it always did, and was now curled under the front window in its favorite spot, where the floor was warmest. Earl had come and gone with a fresh trim. Roy had waved from next door without stopping. The street was calm and the sky was a flat pale gray, the kind that meant nothing in particular. Then the shadow came. It did not arrive slowly. One moment the street was lit by the flat gray morning light, and the next moment that light was simply gone, swallowed whole, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the entire sky. Glen was standing at the counter with a cloth in his hand when the room went dark, and he looked up at the window and saw nothing but shadow beyond it. He heard the sound a moment later. It was not a crash or a roar. It was a landing, but a landing on a scale that made the floor of the shop tremble beneath his feet, that sent the combs sliding along the counter and made the lamp flicker and the water in the back pot slosh against its sides. A deep, heavy, settling sound, like a hillside deciding to sit down. Pip's eyes opened. The hatchling lifted its head and went completely still, nostrils working, ears up. It did not look frightened. It looked like something had shifted inside it, something deep and known, and Glen watched the hatchling's expression change in a way he had never seen before. Not fear. Not excitement. Something older than both. Glen set down his cloth and walked to the front door. He opened it and stepped outside. The street was empty. Every person who had been on it a moment before was gone, pressed into doorways or ducked behind wagons or simply frozen flat against the nearest wall with wide eyes and no voice. Roy was halfway behind his own front door, gripping the frame with both hands. Vera was nowhere to be seen. Even Alf from the post office, who could usually be heard from 2 streets away, was silent. In the middle of the street stood Sorra. She was enormous. Glen had understood the word enormous his whole life, had used it for large things, big storms, tall trees, wide rivers. He understood now that he had been using too small a word for too small a collection of things. Sorra made the street disappear beneath her. Her body was long and dark, the color of deep water, with scales that caught no light because they were too large and too old to bother with it. Her wings were folded against her sides, but even folded they reached above the rooftops on both sides of the street. Her tail stretched back past the grain store and curled around the corner out of sight. Her head was lowered, and her eyes were on the barbershop door. On Glen. They were gold, her eyes. Not bright gold, not cheerful gold, but the heavy dark gold of something very old and very certain. They were fixed on him with an attention that pressed against his chest like a hand flat on a door. Glen stood on his front step and looked up at her. He did not step back. He was not sure his legs would have done it even if he had asked them to. There was something about standing in front of something that large that simply emptied out the ordinary instructions. His hands were steady. His breathing was slow. He felt, in a strange and quiet way, completely calm. Sorra's nostrils flared once. She could smell Pip on him. On the shop. On everything. She said nothing. She did not need to. Glen spoke first. "Your hatchling is inside," he said. His voice came out even and clear in the empty street. "It has been coming here for a few weeks now. It is safe. It has not been hurt. It has not been kept. It comes and goes as it wants." Sorra's eyes did not move from him. "It sleeps here sometimes," Glen continued. "Near the stove in the back or by the front window where it is warm. I play music. That is all. That is the whole of it." A long silence followed. The town did not breathe. Then Sorra moved her head. Slowly, carefully, the way something very large learns to move around things that are very small and breakable. She lowered it until it was level with the shop window and she looked through the glass. Inside, Pip was sitting up beside the barber chair, looking back at its mother through the window with those wide amber eyes. The hatchling's tail was moving slowly. Not frightened. Not frozen. Simply looking. Sorra made a sound then. Glen felt it more than heard it, a low sound from somewhere deep in her chest, too low for a growl, too soft for a roar. It moved through the street and through the walls and through the soles of Glen's boots and into the floor beneath him. It was, Glen realized, the sound a mother makes when she finds what she has been looking for. He reached into his shirt pocket without thinking and wrapped his fingers around his harmonica. Not to play it. Just to hold it. The way you hold something familiar when the world around you becomes very large and very still. Sorra lifted her great head slowly and looked at Glen again. The gold eyes were different now. The weight was still there, but something else had come into them. Something that had not been there before when she had first looked at him. She was waiting. Glen stood in the empty street under the shadow of the greatest creature he had ever seen, and he stood there the same way he always stood. Straight and steady and without fuss. Sorra did not move for a long time. She stayed where she was in the middle of the street, her great head still lowered from looking through the shop window, her gold eyes now resting on Glen with that same heavy, patient attention. The town around her was absolutely silent. No cartwheels. No voices. No doors opening or closing. Even the wind seemed to have decided to wait. Glen stood on his front step and waited with it. Finally Sorra spoke. Her voice was low, lower than Glen expected, not the thundering sound he might have imagined from something her size. It was deep and slow and careful, like a river moving under ice, and it filled the street without needing to be loud. "What did you play?" she said. It was not quite a question. It was the kind of sentence that already knows an answer exists and is simply asking for it to be handed over. Glen understood her perfectly. "The first time," he said, "it was just an old tune. Nothing with a name. I learned it when I was young and I have played it most of my life." Sorra waited. Glen lifted the harmonica from his shirt pocket. He looked at it for a moment in his hand, small and dented and worn smooth on the edges from years of use. Then he brought it to his lips and began to play. The tune came out the same way it always did. Slow and wandering, moving up and then down and then turning back on itself the way a path does when it is in no hurry to arrive anywhere. It was not a grand piece of music. It was not the kind of thing anyone would call beautiful in a formal sense. It was just honest and steady and familiar, the kind of tune that felt like a fire in a quiet room. Glen played it through from beginning to end without stopping. The street stayed silent. The town stayed still. And Sorra, the great dragon queen who had crossed 3 kingdoms and circled valleys and pulled apart forests in her search, stood in the middle of a small human street and listened to an old barber play a song on a dented harmonica, and she did not move a single scale. When the last note faded, Glen lowered his hand and waited. Sorra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She stopped crying when you played that." Glen looked up. "She cried when she first came in," he said. "I did not know what else to do." "No," Sorra said slowly. "She cried before that. 4 days before that. I could not stop it." Pause. "I tried everything I knew." Glen said nothing to that. There was nothing useful to say and he knew it. "She found your shop on her own," Sorra continued. "She slipped away while I was sleeping. I woke and she was gone and I have been searching since that morning." The gold eyes moved briefly to the shop window where Pip was still sitting, watching its mother through the glass with a calm, steady expression. "I thought something had happened to her." "She was never in any danger," Glen said. "Not here." "I can see that," Sorra said. The words were simple but the weight behind them was not. Glen heard what was in them. Not just relief. Something more than relief. The particular feeling of a parent who has been carrying a fear for a long time and has just been allowed to set it down. Glen walked to the front door of his shop and opened it. He did not call for Pip or gesture or make any signal. He simply left the door open and stepped aside. A moment passed. Then Pip came out. The hatchling moved through the doorway and onto the front step and then into the street, its small claws clicking on the cobblestones. It walked without hurrying, crossing the space between the shop and its mother, and stopped just beneath Sorra's great lowered head. The two of them looked at each other for a long quiet moment. Sorra made that low sound again, the deep soft one that moved through walls and floors and the soles of boots. Pip made a smaller version of the same sound back. Then the hatchling pressed its head against Sorra's nose and stayed there. Glen watched from his step and said nothing. After a moment Sorra lifted her head gently and shifted one enormous claw forward across the cobblestones, opening it flat on the ground the way you might open a hand. Pip stepped onto it without hesitation, turned once in a small circle and settled down. Sorra raised her claw slowly and brought Pip close to her chest, cradling the hatchling in the careful way of something that has learned to be gentle with what it loves. She spread her wings. The sound of them opening was like 2 sails catching a sudden wind, a deep clean snap that pushed air down the street in both directions and set every loose thing in Redwall shifting and rattling. The shadow deepened for a moment. Glen felt the air move across his face. But before she rose, Sorra stopped. She turned her great head one final time and lowered it toward Glen. Not toward the town. Not toward the street. Toward him specifically, the old barber standing alone on his front step with a harmonica in his hand and sawdust on his apron. She brought her head down slowly and held it there, level with him, close enough that Glen could see every line and marking on the dark scales of her face. It was a bow. Glen looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the same small nod he gave at the end of every haircut, simple and honest and without any extra to it. Sorra rose. The wind came down hard and the lamp inside the shop swayed and Roy grabbed his fence post with both hands and every eye in Redwall turned up to watch the great dark shape climb into the pale sky with something small and green held safely against its chest. Glen watched until she was gone. Then he turned around, went back inside, picked up his cloth and wiped down the counter.